Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience while we worked through a few technical issues on our end here. So it's really wonderful to see so many of you here this morning. It's an honor to be joined by so many of you whose work we greatly admire. And we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to those of you joining through our YouTube live stream from all over the world. So my name is Holly Johnson, and I'm the Associate Director of Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. And for those of you who are not yet familiar with our work, Global Freedom of Expression was established in 2014 by Columbia University President Lisi Bollinger to bring together judges, lawyers, journalists, scholars, and activists to advance understanding of international norms that protect freedom of expression. Today, we are honored to co-host this important event on the role of academia in protecting freedom of expression as a driver for other human rights with the University of Liverpool, University of Sheffield, and the World of Journalism Study in commemoration of UNESCO's World Press Freedom Day. This year, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day, which gives us a unique opportunity to discuss freedom of expression's role as an enabler of other rights, its role in facilitating democratic governance, and as an antidote against censorship, autocracies, and authoritarian governments. Global freedom of expression monitors how the judiciary protects freedom of expression and balances rights. Our flagship project is a comprehensive legal database of court decisions related to freedom of expression, which currently hosts more than 2,000 briefs on legal decisions from more than 130 countries. Versions of the database are also available in Spanish, Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Russian. The database is an important tool for researchers seeking to identify trends and emerging norms and standards to inform their work or advocacy efforts aimed at protecting and promoting freedom of expression. We've also launched a special collection paper series, which summarizes case law from the database in 15 thematic areas of central importance for the defense of freedom of expression globally, ranging from the right to protest to the right to be forgotten. These papers are designed to promote the right to freedom of expression in the judicial decision-making process and support strategic litigation in freedom of expression cases. So this is the first of 13 events that Global Freedom of Expression is organizing in the context of World Press Freedom Day. It is no coincidence that is the first of all the conferences, because it is a topic that, in addition to being intrinsically significant, is a topic interconnected with all the others. The Academy has a crucial role to play in the protection of fundamental rights. In researching and studying freedom of expression, it is imperative to analyze and report on how violations of freedom of expression have an unavoidable impact on other human rights, such as freedom of assembly, access to information, the right to privacy, among others. Most importantly, the Academy is responsible for the fundamental task of educating and training the next generation of journalists, human rights defenders, scholars, and lawyers. This morning, we have a distinguished group of scholars presenting on current challenges to safety of journalists and media freedom. The chat is open, and we encourage our online participants to post questions, which will be addressed at the end of the sessions. Finally, I'd like to encourage all the members of our audience, in person and virtual, to engage with us on Twitter during the event and tweet during the sessions. Be sure to use the hashtag World Press Freedom Day, and you can also follow us at Columbia GFOE. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tawfiq Jelassi, Assistant Director General for Communication and Information at UNESCO, who will formally open the conference for us. Dr. Jelassi is responsible for UNESCO's programs on fostering freedom of expression, leading digital transformation, strategizing the role of ICT in education, and building inclusive knowledge societies. He holds a PhD doctorate in Management Information Systems from New York University and postgraduate diplomas from the University of Paris Dauphine. He is the former Minister of Higher Education, Scientific Research, and Information and Communication Technologies in Tunisia. It is an honor to pass the floor to Dr. Jelassi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Holly Johnson, Associate Director of Columbia Freedom of Expression, Professor Jackie Harrison, UNESCO Chair on Media Freedom, Journalism Safety, and the Issue of Impunity, Dr. Vera Slavsheva-Petkova, Reader in Global Journalism and Media at the University of Liverpool, distinguished friends from academia, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be with you at Columbia University this morning. Just arrived last night from Paris. So for me, it's 4-5 a.m. my biological time. Very happy to see this collaborative event between Columbia University, Sheffield University, and Liverpool University. And as you did mention, this is in the context of our 2023 World Press Freedom Day and Conference celebrations, which, as you said, marks the 30th anniversary of the UN General Assembly having proclaimed in April 1993, May 3rd of every year, as the World Press Freedom Day. We have a full week of events, with tomorrow the main political day taking place at the United Nations General Assembly Hall. This is, I believe we had 7 past editions of the World Press Freedom Day academic conferences. Last year it was in Punta del Este, Uruguay, and some of you I met with at that event, which was highly successful. And I'm very happy, being an academic myself, that we continue on this good tradition. You did mention the theme of this year, which is the role of academia in protecting freedom of expression as a driver for all other human rights. I think this theme demonstrates the possibilities of networking across oceans, across universities, but also to pursue a noble cause, which is the freedom of expression and the safety of journalists in connection with our global World Press Freedom Day and Conference. I would like also to mention that academia, and I used to be for 35 years university professor and dean, academia has, in my view, a distinctive comparative advantage, which is the evidence-based research outcome and publications, which very much informs policymakers and leaders across the globe regarding tackling the key issues related to media development, freedom of expression, but also including, of course, the negative sides and the harmful content, especially online, spread through digital platforms. So there are many challenges that you all face, and that the communities in which your academic institutions are embedded face. And I think academia, again, has the objective, neutral, research-based approach that the political spheres do not have. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to appreciate the very important work that is done by the Safety of Journalists Research Network at Sheffield University under the leadership of Professor Harrison, the Words of Journalism Study Association at the University of Liverpool under the leadership of Dr. Petkova, but also, of course, the Columbia Global Freedom of Expression under the leadership of Dr. Johnson. These academic efforts have, over time, significantly contributed to promoting freedom of expression, to defending freedom of expression, but also, of course, to fostering the safety of journalists. It is in this context that I also would like to appreciate the work that all of you presenting your research here today have been doing, and for your invaluable contribution to achieving the objectives of the United Nations Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity for crimes committed against journalists. Some of you may recall that last we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on journalists and the issue of impunity, a plan of action that has originated at UNESCO some 10 years ago and has become a UN-wide plan of action. As you know very well, academic research is one of the 6 pillars of the implementation of this UN plan of action. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance that you attach to this contribution. At the Vienna High-Level Conference that we organized last November to celebrate this 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action, all participants and their the government representatives reiterated their strong commitment and engagement with the UN Plan of Action. We had even pledges exceeding $100 million to continue our actions, programs, and activities on this important theme. This demonstrates the catalytic power of normative instruments that we collectively come up with, including this UN Plan of Action for the safety of journalists in order to mobilize actions around the principles that these instruments present. The theme of this year's edition of World Press Freedom Day, shaping the future of rights, freedom of expression as a driver for all other rights. This theme demonstrates not only the centrality, but also the multidimensional linkages between freedom of expression and other aspects of our lives. Given that attacks against journalists are getting more complex, I believe that this framework is important for academia to help us better understand the dynamic forces that drive these threats. Reading through your academic consultations report, I'm glad to note that there is a need for increased multi and interdisciplinary work in our research projects, very much to produce a comprehensive understanding of the complex nature of the contemporary and rapidly evolving issues around the safety threats to journalists. And here I would like to reiterate the need for academic research that transcends journalism, communication discipline, and goes into other disciplines like psychology, political science, law, sociology, computer science, and history, leveraging interdisciplinary research opportunities as well. It is evident that one of the emerging areas of dealing with emotional well-being and trauma that journalists suffer would benefit a lot from the psychology discipline. The same can be said about computer science studies that can enrich our understanding of online threats against journalists. Let me here, before closing, remind you that tomorrow evening we'll have a formal ceremony to award the annual UNESCO Guillermo Cano Prize, the World Press Freedom Prize, to this year's laureates. This prize has been awarded for the last 26 years to an individual, an institution, or an organization who have demonstrated a lot of courage and determination to defend and promote freedom of expression, quite often in the face of a lot of danger. The news are under embargo, but tomorrow evening you'll find out who is going to receive this very prestigious World Press Freedom Prize. And we are very happy and honored that the last two recipients of our prize ended up receiving 6 months later the Nobel Peace Prize. That was the case of Maria Ressa in May 2021, receiving the UNESCO Prize, then in November, getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And last year, we awarded our UNESCO Prize to the Belarusian Association of Journalists. So keep tuned for tomorrow's news. Let me wish you very enriching discussions and exchanges today. Thank you very much for your presence here, for your presence online, for your contribution, and for defending such a noble cause that unites us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. And now it's my great pleasure to pass the floor to my wonderful co-hosts, Professor Jackie Harrison and Dr. Vera Sacheva-Petkova.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to say, of course, thank you very much to Dr. Johnson, Dr. Holly Johnson, and the Columbia Global Freedom of Expression for this fine room and for all the support from her and her colleagues. It's much appreciated. And thanks to Dr. Jayasi for his welcome and official opening of this conference, and for the continued support from UNESCO for our academic input into World Press Freedom Day and other related events, and also to my colleagues and peers at the University of Liverpool and journalism for being collaborators on this conference. So yes, a very warm welcome to this academic conference and to a sunny rather than damp, shall I say very wet New York, which of course does mark the 30th anniversary, as we said, from 1993. And of course, Press Freedom Day has continued to happen in its different guises over all those years, with the academic conference beginning a few years ago. But so much has changed since 1993. It seems like a lifetime, well, several lifetimes ago to me anyway. But what is continuing, of course, but in different ways, is the suppression of freedom of expression by state authorities and other powerful forces by a variety of means. And in many ways, those means have become more sophisticated and complicated, such as the development of digital authoritarianism. And we just know, don't we, that they will undoubtedly continue exponentially to increase and change in techniques and specificities. And that's where we are swimming in that sea, I guess. So I'd like to take here the opportunity to reflect on the contribution of academia's research to the global media freedom and journalism safety stakeholder community. So this is a multi-stakeholder community, as Dr. Jelassi said, committed to the human rights of journalists, but also to human rights defenders and also to academia to be able to participate in this wonderful community. And for all of us, it's actually quite an effort, and it's quite a difficult space to be in. Whether you are an academic or whether you're a human rights defender or whether you're a journalist, there are those forces that are making all of our jobs more difficult. And there are challenges about where the limits on free speech might be tolerated, given respects for human dignity and toleration are not always guaranteed through this free speech right. And again, throw into the mix then the call for reduction in hate speech, generational cultural differences relating to the extent to which one person's freedoms might, for example, be balanced against another person's well-being. And then that in turn is happening in the UK, brings about the weaponization and demands for free speech, stoking of culture wars, the use of moral equivalency as a free speech right, and on it goes. And we are in the midst of all of that, brought together through our wonderful collaborative efforts. We're trying to, in this increasingly challenging environment, to seek to understand, to connect issues to safety, to ever-changing, wider social, cultural, political, economic, financial, civil contexts. Or as I like to think of it, there is in fact a very stormy sea in which we all swim, and often against the tide. So globally, the conditions within which journalists are able to exercise freedom of expression, of course, vary from state to state. But of course, we can see those similarities in the use of illiberal toolkits by state authorities. In those national contexts, it's vital to look at news journalism in a holistic way to understand the strengths and fragilities of the whole news environment. Basically, the newscape is in disarray. And that, of course, requires a nuanced understanding of the civil diminishment of news and the civil diminishment of public debate and discussion. And where we try to assert greater media freedoms and freedom of expression, I think what's at base there is actually the communicative base of societies themselves. And that's in extremis, sometimes is a suspension of the role of public sentiment and public opinion in societies. And whether we express ourselves calmly, reasonably, liberally, illiberally, the news journalism reflects that, and we reflect back to those discussions as well. So cyclically, the tone and content of that voice often derives from the institutional setting in which news journalism finds itself. So again, I think our contribution from academia, as Dr. Jelassi said, is about understanding, highlighting, publicising, theorising, and exemplifying the complexity of those assaults on media freedom and freedom of expression. And what's wonderful to see is just how that's grown in scope and scale and quality and motivation and passion over the last few years, as we seek to do what we always do, which is to identify the problems, their root causes, their manifestations, their outcomes and effects, through the use of innovative yet replicable methods, to find new ways of grouping and categorizing complexity, providing evidence-based peer-reviewed research, which can and is being used by stakeholders beyond academia. And getting to this point where we are today, by which I mean regularly gathering and exchanging knowledge, research, as a recognized and recognizable collective interdisciplinary global academic community, focusing together on global equivalence. It's taken a few years to achieve. We've all been doing these things, but we've been doing them and perhaps not quite talking to each other in a way. But now it's thriving. It's got its own momentum and it's creating a bigger and faster momentum. And so I think some might go so far as to say that we and our wider networks contribute to the attempts to reclaim the information sphere, or at the very least understand and emphasize the extent to which it is in disarray. And I think that in this context and in the spirit of World Press Freedom Day, we can say we work together with other stakeholders to protect and give effect to other fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, I'm aware I've not got much time, so I'm just going to say how we've done that just very briefly. In other words, by we, I mean global academic, the global academic community. So it has increased in terms of the research has increased since the start of the UN Action Plan 2012. And it's also, academia has also played a large part in implementing the UN Plan of Action, with lines of action in the implementation strategy since 2012, and being involved in World Press Freedom Day, International Day to End Impunity, working with the UNESCO's research agenda, launching the Journalism Safety Research Network in 2016. And it's continued to grow and develop to the point where the JSRN now has 250 researchers involved in that network who work at universities, research centres and civil society organisations around the world. And it's just launching its regional working groups in order to further facilitate and exchange knowledge in relation to these issues. We've also been, I think, trying to understand or at least collect together what it is we've all been doing. So at CFOM, we've developed, well, we did a literature stocktake and developed a database which has all the literature we can find, including the grey literature, on what we're doing as scholars, and that's accessible. We can all use it. Civil society organisations, UNESCO can use it. And I think that way we're actually showcasing our research together, and we're also through engagement with civil society organisations through things like journalism flash talks and exchange of knowledge, talking to each other in ways that we haven't done before. So in terms of what we're actually looking at as a community, the themes have been, not surprisingly, around areas of digital safety, trauma, well-being is increasing in focus, and also the way that law is being weaponized and used. Obviously, gender is a very big part of what we're all looking at as a community. And impunity works at workplace safety, monitoring attacks, as well as obviously journalism within war and conflict, are all areas that the community is actually looking at. But more I think significant is that 3/4 of us are from media, communication and journalism backgrounds. But there is that growing interest from law, politics, psychology, and that's where we are starting to expand into interdisciplinary working, which I think is absolutely vital. If we're going to be solving knotty problems, we need people who are looking at it from other perspectives. And in the sense of that, I think there's some glaring omissions that we've not talked about so far today, but I'm sure that they will come up, such as AI, which is obviously going to embed everything, we think, in terms of what we're doing, but also the idea of journalistic agency as well.
You're out. Stop.
Sorry.
Okay.
Talking to AI.
AI.
It's not.
Is that,
Human.
yeah, I was going to say, is that an intervention? Anyway, just to say that there's so much more we're going to do as a community, and I'm really proud to be part of it. And on that, I wish you a very enjoyable conference, and I'll hand over now to Vera.
Thank you, Jackie, and again welcome from me to everyone. We were really pleased we could pull the event together in such a short space of time, and really grateful for obviously to Holly for hosting and organizing everything, and to UNESCO and Dr. Jelassi for being able to join us and also helping us set the framework for the event. and publicized it. And we've been working with Jackie and Sheffield for a while now on a few of these events. So it has been a pleasure collaborating on this one as well. We're really pleased that we have so many online participants. I can see in the chat, people are saying hello from Mexico, from Africa. So it's absolutely brilliant. So building on, can I?
Yes, yes. I'm going to share the screen right now, and then I will hand you your presentation.
Yes, so this is a photo of University of Liverpool. Liverpool at the minute is completely dedicated to two events, the coronation of King Charles and Eurovision taking place as well there. But what I'm going to talk about today is two main initiatives, building on what has already been done and all the major achievements, and trying to be as all-inclusive as possible. So the first one is what we are doing as part of the Worlds of Journalism study. For those of you who are not familiar with the study, we conduct representative surveys with journalists currently in 120 countries. The study has been running for over a decade now, but one new thing about this current wave, which we should complete field work by the end of this year, is that we included safety questions for the first time in collaboration with UNESCO, with Guy. We worked a lot on the design of the questions. We involved the Journalism Safety Network as well. So what we hope to get by the end of this year is a very clear picture of the threats experienced by journalists in the past 5 years, as well as the support networks that they have or don't have. The stress, we have included stress questions as well, which is interesting for the first time, trying to bring in this more psychological dimension into the work. We have questions on resilience, on impunity, and their perceptions of freedom of expression in their countries. So we hope that once we have all the data, we would be able to put together a global index on journalist safety, comparing trends across the countries that we have, which are from all over the world, of course. And we are also hoping to be able to integrate some external data, although that is very tricky because obviously, as Dr. Gelas pointed out in the beginning, we have a different way of doing research in academia, much more kind of thorough way. So it's difficult to pull together external data from other sources, but this work is currently ongoing. And what we will be aiming to do through the global index is build on this conceptualization of safety, which we did together, a group of us, that was published in a journal article in Digital Journalism earlier this year, which defines safety as including 4 key dimensions: physical, psychological, digital, and financial. When we first presented it last year at the academic consultation at UNESCO headquarters, Guilherme also pointed out to us that it's probably worth including a legal dimension, which we have included within the other dimensions, but it might indeed be worth kind of paying special attention to it. And we're hoping that through the index, we would be able to compare trends across these dimensions, across well, we have 120 countries. Realistically speaking, we'll probably end up with 80, 90 if everyone submits their data sets on time, but this will still be a major resource on safety issues. The other thing that we have started working on is this new online platform on journalist safety, which we have bought the domain for. It will be called safetyofjournalists.org. So we are doing this as a joint initiative between the University of Liverpool and the Worlds of Journalism study in cooperation with UNESCO. So this was as a result of, we signed letters last year of agreement. Dr. Jalasi signed a letter with us, the Worlds of Journalism Study Association, trying to again build on this multi-stakeholder approach, but also trying to be as all-inclusive as possible to scholars from all over the world and presenting our research to non-academic partners. So the idea here is the database that they have at Sheffield is brilliant for academics who have access to the journals that these articles are published in, but unfortunately it is the case that a lot of scholars, even from my country, Bulgaria, which is supposedly a global north country, they haven't got the resources to access these publications. So what we are asking researchers now is to present their main findings in a very succinct way, with the key findings, key implications for policymakers as well, to this platform. And if they want to deposit the original output, they can also do that there. So all the precious research that has been done in academia can actually serve the purpose of informing policy much more so than it currently does. And academics can again continue or build bridges with NGOs and between themselves to work together on these important issues. The idea behind this platform is indeed, as we have mentioned in these letters of agreement with UNESCO, is to provide a platform for sharing of academic research within the framework of implementation of the UN Plan of Action. We have also invited so far over 20 NGOs, but we will invite more to present their work in the area of safety of journalists, again, in a succinct way with their key priorities, key gaps on the platform. We will be conducting interviews with safety champions from across the different fields to discuss these issues. There will be also a separate toolkit section, toolkits for journalists or anything to do with journalist safety, because one of the conversations what some of my colleagues had with one of the big media companies in the UK is that what they said is they don't need another toolkit on journalist safety, but they would very much love to have a database where all the toolkits are in one place and can be used. So we are welcoming everyone to join us for this effort, to please, you should, I hope everyone should have received an invitation by now, but it's actually a very good idea to send these invitations not just to the communication and journalism networks, as you said, but beyond that. So maybe we should do that in the next few months, so people from other disciplines can also contribute. We haven't actually thought of that, so it's great that you brought it up. And we are hoping to be able to launch it by the end of July, and then to be updating it regularly. So if anyone has any suggestions, please let me know, but also it's for everyone, for everyone's benefit. So please make use of it. And we will work with Jackie as well to see how to best present the work of the Journalism Safety Research Network and to ensure that everyone feels involved and included in that effort, which I'm a key believer in the need to de-Westernize journalism study more generally, and this field in particular as well, because as we can see even from the chat today, colleagues from the global south are very much interested in these topics and they affect them so much. So that's it from me. If anyone has any questions about any of that, please get in touch. And again, thank you very much for coming today. And I look forward to hearing all the presentations. So I think we have just a few minutes before we conclude the first panel. Does anyone have any questions? Yes,
Vera, how do you feel, and in fact also perhaps Jackie, the same question, how do you feel the arguments for journalists' safety as being an issue or more important than, let's say, other people's safety in the world? How do you feel those arguments are received by members of the public today? The argument for journalist safety?
Do you want me to go first?
Okay, and it's a brilliant question. actually.
Yes.
I mean, I can't speak worldwide, but interesting, my colleague and I did, Steph Carlis is here from Sheffield, a while ago, did a focus group just about this issue. And we found that the public were kind of not that interested until we started explaining to them some things that had happened, both in the UK, but worldwide. And what we found then was that individuals then started to understand what was at stake. Actually, when there's an attack on journalism, there's an attack on freedom of expression and ultimately on their right to receive information, and that this is happening in other places and that you lose it very easily and it's very hard to get freedom of expression back. So there is something, I mean, it might just have been our focus groups, it was a small study, but it was interesting how that was in the UK, it's time scale, but I would imagine that's going to change from country to country, actually. But I just got a feeling that most people just view journalists with some, shall we say, skepticism in many parts of the world, which isn't the case in some places where journalists are actually risking their life and being human rights defenders and activists. And in those cases, then I think, you know, there's a different relationship because people are incredibly brave. If there's a sort of samizdat out version of the press, then there's a different attachment to it. So it's a complex question, but and not that easy to answer. But I hope that sort of addresses where we're coming from.
Yeah, I can. Yes, you go first. No, I just wanted to say that you all know that trust in journalists has been basically going down worldwide, I think, but particularly in the global north.
Not quite worldwide.
No, yeah. But sometimes I even have trouble persuading my students who are communications and media students that the work of journalists is very important and they shouldn't using derogatory terms when referring to the work of journalists. So there is a lot of work to be done in that area, and a lot of it is in the hands of journalists as well, I think, but there are so many complicated factors at play. Sorry, Dr. Jelasky.
I think the two of you have addressed the question, which is a very important one. Let me say that this is more for information, that at UNESCO we are extending the concept of safety of journalists to artists, scientists, educators. And tomorrow we'll be announcing a major initiative to leverage the work and experience that UNESCO has developed over 3 decades on the safety of journalists to extend it to artists. But we know during the COVID-19, scientists were attacked as well, especially online. And UNESCO has a major role in education. We recently had the Transforming Education Summit, and we also want to extend this concept to educators as well. So your question still remains very important. I'm not answering your question, but I'm saying how we see things, leveraging what you have done over 30 years on the safety of journalists to other professions.
One, there is a last Friday, Saturday, there was a conference by the Knights Foundation
Yes.
about, are you related to that in Colombia or with separate entity? I'm just wondering because if you don't collaborate with them or not. But the second question, and the question is academic freedom in the United States. I don't know about the others. There's some mention of Russia. There's a lot of debate within American educational system that there's not academic freedom anymore. I don't know whether you heard about what happened at Stafford Law School, where a judge appointed by Trump came in and was literally booed away by the students. There's a lot of debate going on. Is there academic freedom within the educational system on both sides? You go to the South, there's a lot of debate going on about CRT and everything. And so the left also has a lot of issues with academic freedom and doing their own research. So how do you see the prospect of educating and teaching students when there's no real academic freedom within the education system?
That is an excellent question. Maybe Holly can answer the question about the Knight Foundation in Colombia, because I don't know whether there is any collaboration between.
Sure, it is an independent academic center at Columbia, so it's affiliated, and we do cooperate on certain events and certain research when we have the opportunity. So they're very focused on First Amendment issues, and ours is a global perspective. So when they intersect, we try to do things together.
Oh, thank you.
On the question of academic freedoms, we actually, because we held the online version of this event on Thursday, we had an excellent presentation by a colleague from Spain who has conducted a survey into this issue about academic freedoms. And it is very, very much pronounced, of course, as you mentioned, in some countries, like obviously Russia, Turkey as well, China, I know from personal experience, but increasingly so in the global north. And I think what she was saying, because I'm not an expert in that particular area about academic freedoms, what she was saying is that there is a dearth of research on that. So while we have anecdotal evidences with the case study you pointed out, and we hear from colleagues who are very careful what they say in the lecture theaters, basically, because in some countries they might be reported to the authorities. I've spoken to Turkish colleagues who are really cautious when they talk about journalism, because a student might then report them and there are repercussions for them. But I think from what I know, again, Jackie might know more, there isn't much in terms of academic research in that area. And it's probably worthwhile doing something more kind of global and comparative, because
Sorry, there is a new report, it should be 2 years ago, about freedom of academic expression within the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights,
okay.
special rapporteur. And it's a case about the Chilean professor.
A little bit louder, I can't hear you.
Sorry? Oh, yes. There is a new report, it should be 2 years ago, from the American Commission of Human Rights, the special rapporteur, about academic freedom of expression. There is a case against Chile. It should be 1.5 years, Carabelli. It's about a professor using his freedom of expression in academic areas, from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights.
Yes.
If we have, I know if we have enough time, but yes, just a quick question. And I had Dr. Shapiro mentioning on the, that's just a comment and a question. One on the trust in the media. And this is where I think, especially research, decentralizing research outside of, yes, trust in the media, as we see perhaps in US, Europe, maybe depending on which media actually, again, but in regions like in Ghana, in Africa, we're seeing still big trust in radio, for example. So I think we still need more to contextualize when it comes to trust in the media. It is a big thing that I think we should. And I want to actually commend you and the team for the this database on journalism and the safety of journalists. I'm hoping that there will be still more in what you're measuring and what more you want to look at, including, of course, the legal framework, political influences which are growing. In some contexts, we may also even want to take a look at the social cultural environment. In some of our regions, still journalism, even the term journalist and how it's described locally, in my language, sounds more of a gossip. And so it comes with that kind of tag. And so when it comes to even explaining the work we do as journalists, that alone has its own, based on the expression or how it is framed. So I think some of the social cultural norms would be nice to also see in those lenses. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, no, that's an excellent point, because as you say, context really matters. Say I am from Bulgaria, and the situation there in our region at the minute is horrible with regards to how all these initial freedoms of, we still have the freedoms, it's just that trust in journalism has diminished really significantly, and we talk about illiberal trends in many respects, unfortunately. But as you say, cross-nationally and also among the different media organizations, there are massive differences. And I think that's why the research that we all do is really valuable in shedding light on these differences and similarities and trying to make sense of them rather than just passing judgment. Is often the case. Yeah.
I would also say that the work that you do is very important because also when journalists and media workers are attacked, many times it also happens transnationally. So I work on a program for the safety and protection of journalists, and it's an emergency program, but we work with a vast network of journalists in distress groups and a culture of safety alliance. And we see that more and more, where a journalist or journalists may have to flee their country because of oppression, and then different types of intelligence or otherwise may have relations with that country, or may actively seek that journalist, including at great expense, like Pegasus still is very expensive, but there was, no problem with certain governments spending millions to target an individual journalist. And now it's much more readily used for slaps. We've seen the rise in that, just unbelievably high worldwide amongst cases that we work on and our partners. And I think another thing that may be very interesting for you, which I'm sure you tapped into, but many of the organizations who work when journalists or media workers are at risk worldwide, documentation done is who did what to whom, when, where, often documented why, how, and also of interest is when there's an opportunity which may or may not be obvious. It may not have been something recently published, but the assailant had an opportunity because of the environment or because of a law or during COVID, because people were in lockdown or otherwise. So I think there's quite a bit there, and we can talk more about the different networks who are constantly working together.
Yeah, that is, yes, thank you very much for this excellent remark. It's worth getting in touch and making sure that we do kind of use this relationships that we form over the years with the different networks, because my personal research in journalist safety started when I did a study in Russia back in 2014 in Novaya Gazeta, and a few other obviously outlets. And as we know now, as you say, a lot of them work in exile. They cannot do what they used to be able to do. It's so sad really just to observe even just this one case study. And it's important that we work together, and obviously we have different ways of working in academia compared to civil society or international organizations, but the more we talk to each other, then the more of a chance we get to really make a difference, I think. And one of the other things that struck me when I started looking into this is how few countries actually have national plans for the safety of journalists and national committees, which is, I guess UNESCO has probably worked on that, but it just coming out from outside in that area, it's really striking. So it was really good to see how many countries committed, as you said, in Vienna to investing resources in this issue. Thank you very much for your contributions to this first panel. I think we can bring it to a close now, so we have enough time for the excellent contributions from the other panelists in the other panels. Thank you very much. Yes, of course. Thank you very much for coming. Yes, yes, thank you.
You guys can switch to the angle.
Okay.
So this panel is.
It is.
All right.
This little corner.
I was thinking we're gonna fill 45 minutes, but now it's less.
Emily.
There'll be 20 minute discussions.
And sometimes it's one of those things, isn't it? Sometimes it never seems to
Your files for 12:15, 12:45.
I mean, some things are
So we could do 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
In that,
That's a
yeah.
relief. Yeah.
So for the.
Which Okay, so Gemma is chairing this one. Yeah.
You can see Gemma on the screen, that's great.
What was the question? When did our thoughts start?
Gemma, if you would like to start.
So this one is 12. I don't.
Was we would have a very short.
Thank you for, I did notice it and I thought, interesting, that's gonna be challenging. And I will, yeah.
Thanks so much.
So hi everyone, welcome to this first panel. I'm very excited to be chairing this panel focusing on weaponization of the law, topic I'm particularly interested in as a media lawyer. So we have two excellent speakers today, focusing on very topical legal issues, including disinformation and strategic lawsuits against public participation. So I'm going to hand it over first to Dr. Sejal Palmer from Cardiff University, who will be talking about counter-disinformation law as a rising threat to freedom of expression. So Sejal, you have 10 minutes. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Gemma, and thanks to the organisers as well for inviting me to this discussion today. So my paper really draws upon my work currently at the UK Foreign Office, although I'm not a representative of the UK government, and I don't pretend to be, but certainly the work that I've done there advising on the development of a international law compliant foreign policy in the field of disinformation. It's definitely informed and driven this work. And the paper is part of emerging research around what I see as a global trend in law, purportedly on countering disinformation, its practice and implementation, but also a broader discourse, both at the national level, but also at the international level, around disinformation and how that has been deployed to threaten and undermine human rights, particularly freedom of expression. So, as we know, online disinformation encompassing false narratives pushed by states, but also non-state actors, and misinformation are threats to a whole host of interests, including national security and international security, as we see in the context of Russia's invasion and war on Ukraine, as well as election integrity, as we saw in the context of elections, including here in the US, but also in Brazil and many other places, in relation to public health and the responses that were developed in response to the pandemic, as well as the construction of effective responses to the climate crisis, as the latest report by the IPCC highlights. So this new age of disinformation, as President Lee Bollinger of this institution called it at last year's commencement speech, is a legitimate concern for societies the world over, and a major, even dominant preoccupation for many policymakers, media outlets, civil society organizations, and educators. The challenges of disinformation have driven both those policymakers, but also the public across many societies, and their criticism of social media companies for their role in fueling such content. And that's prompted a range of legal and policy responses, especially and most notably, I think, in Europe, including by the EU itself, including the strengthened EU code on disinformation, which sets out commitments and measures to combat disinformation as part of the EU's new regulatory framework under the Digital Services Act, and also the External Action Services promotion of a common framework to create a common understanding and formulate a collective systematic response to foreign interference and information manipulation, or FIMI, as the EU calls it. At the same time, and this is the focus of my paper, the new age of disinformation and the language of disinformation, or false news, fake news, has clearly been co-opted and mobilized to generate law that threatens freedom of expression in an overt and extensive way. So while disinformation can undermine human rights, including freedom of expression, the rise of counter-disinformation law in recent years is an emerging threat and a new threat to freedom of expression, as the reports of many civil society organizations such as the International Press Institute, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Article 19, as well as UNESCO, have shown. There are two notable examples that I'd like to highlight, one being Turkey, the other one being Russia. In both contexts, the criminal law has been used to censor, silence, and shut down independent journalism, political opposition, and critical voices. So in October last year, the Turkish parliament finally adopted, in the run-up to elections, which are happening later this month here in Turkey, a new law that criminalizes anyone for spreading, and I quote, false or misleading information about Turkey's security to create fear and disturb public order. And that allows for up to 3 years imprisonment. In Russia, which already introduced a law back in 2020 around the dissemination of fake news, 10 days after the invasion of Ukraine on the 22nd of February last year, a new set of provisions were adopted to the criminal code and also the administrative code, including a new provision criminalizing the dissemination of deliberately false information about the use of Russian armed forces and activities of other state bodies and private military groups. And this has up to 15 years imprisonment attached to it. And at the moment, according to Article 19's Universal Periodic Review Report, which was just finalized last month, there are about 146 individuals prosecuted under this provision, prosecuted or sentenced under this provision, including, as you would have seen a couple of weeks ago, Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian opposition activist who was sentenced to 25 years in a correctional colony. But there are many states, from Tajikistan, Nicaragua, Cuba, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Myanmar, Mauritania, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Qatar, and Algeria, who adopted or proposed new legislation or have been amending existing regulations to address false or fake news or disinformation, as the excellent Thomson Reuters report, which is going to be launched later today, authored by Joel Simon, Ona Flores, and somebody's name, whose first name I forget, Laria. They present that later today. These laws, but also the context in which they emerge, display a number of characteristics. First, they are firmly framed as counter-disinformation laws, as such, whether it's by using the term disinformation or false news or fake news, much less so fake news. That's really about kind of political rhetoric. Terms which are nonetheless vaguely defined, leading to potentially extensive reach and unpredictability in their implementation. Second, they are justified on what seems compelling state interests, such as public health, and indeed many states adopted laws such as Hungary, Philippines, Thailand, South Africa, Botswana, and they're sort of all in the context of the pandemic around disinformation. But increasingly, we see them adopted on the basis of national security and emergencies. And the Russia example and the Turkish example are the most egregious of those. Third, they emerge within a broader context which is hostile to freedom of expression, and they complement legislation in that way and legal tools in other spheres. So defamation or national security or counterterrorism laws and counter-extremism laws, or cybercrime and cyber libel laws, as well as a whole host of other measures in the spheres of anti-state propaganda and hate speech, and other measures against journalism. But finally, I should just dwell on, because my time is running up, that these laws tend to be incompatible with international human rights law and freedom of expression. For whilst they might serve a legitimate aim, such as preventing disorder or protection of national security, or health or protection of human rights, they invariably lack legal precision and are disproportionate to their purported objectives, and are open to abuse by state and private actors. So the Venice Commission in the Council of Europe context has warned about the adoption of the Turkish law, for example, saying that there is no pressing social need to have such a criminal provision in place. The final point I wanted to make is really a kind of alert or warning about how the international system itself, including UNESCO, and I'm sorry that Dr. Jalassi has left now, is that there is a flurry of activity happening here in New York on the other side of the island, but also in other global citadels of freedom of expression in Paris and Geneva, around various initiatives around integrity or information integrity, including the proposal by the Secretary General of a new code of conduct on information integrity, which is currently being discussed, as well as the development of soft law measures, namely UN resolutions in the sphere of disinformation. There's 2 resolutions adopted by the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council over the last couple of years. So there's a generation of soft law in this area too at the international level. But my anxiety is, I think, one that is shared by some other scholars and activists, which is that these processes could also further and serve to legitimize problematic national laws, and also in another way throw into doubt and question the UN system and how it's actually promoting and protecting freedom of expression itself. So I think all of us, whether scholars or activists or both, and I count myself as both, need to be wary and watchful of the UN processes and threats within the international system itself. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Very much, Miguel. So we'll take a Q&A at the end, but our next speaker is Professor Ed Carter from Brigham Young University School of Communications, and Ed is going to be talking about an anti-SLAPP framework under the American Convention on Human Rights. So Ed,
well, thank you. It's truly a privilege and pleasure to participate on this panel. I appreciate the comments that have been given already and the ideas that have been shared. And I think domestic and international law can create a space, and then culture and society fill in the space. And we talked about that in the last panel a little bit, but as academics, we have an opportunity to help fill in that space through education, sharing research has been discussed. And also I was thinking about 4 other areas where we do that: giving legislative testimony, writing op-eds or opinion pieces in media, engaging in public comment, or organizing public-facing conferences. We all have opportunities to do different things, but I've been able to give legislative testimony in my local regional legislature, and then last year was invited to talk to the Parlamento Andino in Peru. That's a consortium of parliamentarians and lawmakers from various South American countries. I have written op-eds in public media, and then you remember the days working as a journalist when people weren't happy and you'd get hate mail. But that's also important that we create that space and contribute to the public scholarship effort. In the state where I live recently, there was an anti-SLAPP case that was won by a professor at the university where I teach, an environmental studies professor, who had commented in news stories on a real estate developer's plans to put apartments and hotels and homes in the middle of a lake. Sounds like a crazy proposal, and it was, and he said that, and then was sued for defamation. And then I was called by one of my former journalism students to comment on the case. And I was thinking, is my commentary on an anti-SLAPP case going to be considered public debate? Because if I get sued, then am I going to be also covered by the anti-SLAPP statute? But it actually didn't turn out badly for me because I didn't get sued, and didn't turn out badly for him because he won the anti-SLAPP motion. And then finally, organizing public conferences. Last month, we had an opportunity at the university where I am to invite journalists from Latin America to come to a conference that we put together, and we had secured some funding to cover their costs, and that can be, I think, an important way academics can make a contribution. Since last year's meeting in Punta del Este, I've been working on research about how transitional justice can provide a framework for fighting impunity and attacks on journalists. And so my current research is also kind of in that context, and transitional justice is usually thought of as something applicable to recovery from mass human rights abuses. But I think can apply to cases of attacks on journalists, because there are concepts like truth-telling, reparations, ensuring non-recurrence through institutional reform, and investigations and prosecutions when crimes have occurred. And there have been several recent situations where international human rights bodies and people working in that space have used or applied concepts of transitional justice to attacks on journalists. The special rapporteur in the case of Jamal Khashoggi advocated for some of those measures. Also, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights a couple of years ago in a case involving a Colombian journalist named Janith Bedoya talked about the importance of reparations, institutional reform, some of these transitional justice concepts. The special inquiry report in Malta for Daphne Galizia also touched on some of these, and the European Court of Human Rights in the case of Anna Politkovskaya. So I agree with what Dr. Harrison said about the momentum, I think, that's building around academic research and contributions toward freedom of expression and pushing back on impunity for attacks on journalists. And I look forward to seeing that continue. So the current work that I'm looking at is regarding anti-SLAPP in the American Convention of Human Rights system, and the Inter-American Court had a decision a couple of years ago in a case called Palacio Urrutia applying anti-SLAPP. 4 journalists in Ecuador had been sued civilly and also sentenced criminally for writing a piece called No a las Mentiras, No to the Lies, and it had to do with the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa. There had been a national policeman strike, and he decided to go visit, and then he was essentially captive by the police there, and they wouldn't let him go. And then journalists were talking about this. And so the journalists in question had done, I think, what journalists do, engage in critique of the president's performance in this situation and sharing their opinions about it. And then were sued, as I said, sentenced to 3 years in prison. The fine was only $11, but the civil damage award was tens of millions of dollars. So obviously that would be crippling for a news organization. Mr. Palacio Urrutia was able to flee to the United States and received asylum. There was a comment earlier about refugee law and asylum for journalists, which is an area I think that merits further discussion and research, because the normal reasons for getting asylum don't always apply to journalists. You know, persecution based on political opinion, gender, nationality, race, but not necessarily doing journalism. And especially because journalism represents itself to be not doing necessarily opinion, but doing fact-based research and presentation. And so political opinion doesn't always work there. But he was able to obtain asylum. And eventually the Inter-American Court made a decision referencing anti-SLAPP law and just really beginning, I think, the discussion of anti-SLAPP in this regional tribunal. But the court focused on what often is the case in an anti-SLAPP case, which is the matter an issue of public debate? Because, you know, some things are and some things are not. The court talked about 3 elements to look at that: a subjective element that in part examines whether the person being discussed is a public official, somebody in an official capacity, and then a functional element is the person actually functioning in their official capacity for the matter that's being that was discussed. That's the subject of the SLAPP. And then finally, a material element. So is the subject itself one of public relevance? And the important thing I think about anti-SLAPP is that it can give an early way for journalists and others engaging in public debate on these matters of public importance to end a civil lawsuit. And then also to recover attorney's fees. In the case that I mentioned with the lake and the real estate development in the place where I live, the person who was sued was not a journalist, as I said, was a professor, but the piece that he was sued for was his commentary in public media about it. And ultimately, he had to hire lawyers and pay them tens of thousands of dollars, but was able to get the case ended before discovery had started, which can really be obviously time consuming and resource consuming, and then recovered attorney's fees. The Inter-American Court talks about the chilling effect that happens with slaps, and I think that back to the point about whether the public cares about journalists' issues, that to me, I think in the SLAP context is the important thing for us to work on in our educational and public scholarship efforts to help our students and others understand that this SLAP issue for journalists is not really just about journalists giving them special privileges or special ways to get out of lawsuits that anybody else couldn't do. It's really about the quality of our democracy as a function of the quality of our public dialogue, as a function of the quality of the journalism that happens about public issues. So thank you.
Thank you both. I think we've got about 10 minutes for a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for Sejal or
Oh,
yep.
I think my question is directed to Dr. Palmer. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive, and I think we all agree, right, that regulating the flow of information is tricky. And my question is, so what's next? Are we trying to sharpen these laws or toss them? And I'm coming to you from I work for international media support, and I say I think my brave colleagues, media development organization, my brave colleagues are kind of working with sharpening these laws. I think the brave ones are, but most of us are looking at media and information literacy as the answer there. So what do you think?
Should I answer? So the international human rights and regional human rights response, including by the Venice Commission, has been that these laws tend to be disproportionate and unnecessary, even though addressing disinformation is not impermitted. It's not prohibited by international law. It's certainly not required by international law. But what is, I think, part of the positive obligations under freedom of expression is to promote a healthy information environment. It's kind of, what the court talks about in Dink in Turkey, for example, years ago in the judgment, which was in French, which is about having that kind of healthy information environment, and that's been developed since. So from a kind of technical legal perspective, you could argue that if they were very narrowly framed, and if the sanctions weren't criminal, then in principle they could exist. However, invariably these laws, and there has been a sort of proliferation of them across regions, they have been problematic, and even laws in, say, the European Union. In contexts like Hungary, I say even, contexts like Hungary, a country that I lived for 4 years and experienced the attack on academic freedom to my institution, those two have very problematic human rights standards, particularly from the freedom of expression perspective. But yeah, I think I agree with you, the focus ought to be on media and information literacy, and it's interesting that even the strengthened EU code on disinformation, which is sort of tied in with the new regulatory framework in the EU, involves commitments and measures which are not kind of formally binding, but nonetheless in the sphere of research of media and information literacy, and also engagement with researchers and academics. So I think it's those non-legal measures which are going to be the long-term and more effective approaches to addressing disinformation. And just going back to the UN context, which is my kind of focus and preoccupation, there is this focus at UNESCO, which has just last week published its third version of the draft guidelines on the regulation of digital platforms, after kind of a heated debate over the last, certainly the second version. And the emphasis there again, kind of following in step with the Secretary General, is on promoting an internet for trust and on regulation. But I think that, promoting access to, having voice and empowerment of individuals, whether it's, marginalized groups or, women who are being attacked online. I think that the emphasis on how to empower individuals who do not have power in society ought to be much more the focused, rather than the kind of negative side. Because what I fear is that these various initiatives at the global level are going to be collected up and drive those very broad, expansive laws which allow huge discretion on governments. And it's interesting if you look at the debates at the Commission, the Human Rights Council or the Committee on Information in New York, the very same states who are adopting these far-reaching national laws are exactly those states who are promoting and arguing for more restrictive measures at the international level. So a much more nuanced approach, I think, needs to be taken. And those states who are kind of like-minded, who are more supportive of freedom of expression, really need to get their acts together and get together in the Freedom Online Coalition for a kind of concerted response to those hostile actors or bad actors who themselves are promoting disinformation and FEMI, as he likes to call it. Thanks.
Yes, I have a similar question actually for you, Dr. Pomar, but it's related to content moderation, because you mentioned it, and I wonder what type of regulations you have seen and what type of regulations is you envision better, because content moderation is right now and affects media communications, users, so I wonder if you have more to say about.
Yeah, I mean, the international law framework has been drawn upon by especially large digital or very large digital online platforms, in how they moderate their content. And we know this anecdotally, but we also know this through their policies. They have stated commitments to human rights. But I think the case of, Meta's oversight board is very interesting. If you look at the decisions there, they are very kind of jurisprudential. They are developing. I shouldn't use that word because it's not a court. And they say it's not a court, but it's being viewed as a court and labeled kind of a court by certain commentators. But that they are themselves drawing upon international human rights law principles to decide on how Meta and Instagram, Facebook and Instagram as platforms deal with content. The problem there is that, of course, it's just one platform. It's incredibly well resourced, and only a tiny proportion of cases actually have come to the board. Even though they are also making policy recommendations, which have to a certain extent been accepted by the platforms themselves. But I think kind of going back to very, very, very basic principles which derive from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and there is a body of recommendations from special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, from regional courts as well, which can help to develop this, but because there are gaps, of course. The database here at Columbia is also a useful tool in seeing how those gaps can be filled by kind of extrapolating from states' obligations and seeing how these powerful actors can work to address harmful content online, whether it's intentional.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions online, if you want to post them in the chat, we'll try and get them to the speakers as well. Yep.
Go back to the issue of this disinformation from Ghana. And I noticed that across the West African elections are quite tense. And so when you talk about issues of national security, then during elections, politicians are beginning to think about issues of disinformation. I was in Liberia in March. We met with police, service, and they were complaining about disinformation even from diaspora and the extent to which that incites their citizens to violence. And I'm just wondering, at what point do we draw the line? What do you think is public perception around, counter disinformation laws? Because again, the political class and governments are concerned about national security, especially during elections. And so when it's elections, they are beginning to think about how we can counter disinformation and all of that. They are beginning to think about, such laws. I just want to know what you think the public perception is and where do we draw them?
So I don't know about public perception. But what I do understand is that there have been, including the Venice Commission, around its analysis of the Turkish law as it was going through the Turkish legislature, that the time period around elections is extremely sensitive and it's a particular context. On the one hand, you want there to be election integrity and the free flow of information, including verifiable information. At the same time, you don't want to constrain and restrict content, right? So I think those situations are kind of they need to be looked at very closely. But what I don't approve of or support is these sort of knee-jerk measures taken by states right before elections just to take down content which may result in those governments not being elected. But yeah, I mean, I think here in the US, also in Brazil, and other contexts, the situation around elections, I mean, that's become a major concern and something for researchers as well as companies and international human rights authorities to look at more carefully.
If I may add on this very point, I mean, the international legal framework offers some I think some tools. There's a 3-part test from so I think it's really just to come back to the basic, the restriction to freedom of expression, they should be legitimate, legal, and proportional, necessary and proportional. But there is another tool, which is also the Rabat Plan of Action. So really, who offers really against incitement online. So it offers a series of criteria, 6 criteria. I always forget some of them, so I'm not going to make a fool of myself. But it includes really the context, the nature of of course, you're in heated time of election. That's really different than a peaceful time. There is no tension. Of course, the person who is making this news. So if it's a president or if it's my cousin who has 25 people, in his Facebook group, doesn't exactly have the same impact. And so this offers some granularity, for actors to take actions and to restrict freedom of expression. It's not an absolute right. We know that, and it has some criteria that should be used in order that it doesn't also curtail the importance of course, maintaining these essential rights, especially because it's enabling rights for all the other political rights and freedom of assembly, freedom of vote, freedom of political participation, etc. But I think that are some elements that.
We've got time for one more question, Diana.
So you kind of touched on the fact that disinformation is often used as a tool for weaponization against journalists. At least I think that's what you were trying to say, and especially when they're reporting against when they're quite anti-state, for example, or against prominent officials. But you also, I think, if I understood correctly, your solution lies more in education and on measures by, for example, social media companies, so the content moderation side. The problem is that those two currently don't work. So there's been research that shows that people still disseminate the disinformation, even when they know it's disinformation. And even when you give them specific information saying this is wrong, they will still disseminate it because either because they think it's interesting and it's kind of, they don't care, or because they have a very specific agenda. And the issue with the content moderation, you know, we know it's very, very problematic at the moment. So I just wonder if you have any sort of response to that. I mean, it's a difficult problem.
So I know that there is research around various interventions that can take place at various points of a user's interaction with content. You know, whether it's, you know, warnings or, you know, education beforehand. And I know there's research done at institutions like MIT, which has, you know, shown that certain interventions do actually work at certain, depends on what moment that you catch the user, so to speak. But I suppose my answer to that is really the need to reflect on and draw upon the work of other disciplines, including behavioral science. Somebody mentioned psychology, but I think very specifically behavioral science. Currently, I work with data analysts, data scientists, and behavioral scientists. Those are the key professions within many governments working on disinformation. It's not the lawyers. So I think engaging with those as lawyers and policymakers, including in international and intergovernmental institutions, is important. And I think those voices need to be amplified. So I don't have the answer, but I think those groups may be useful.
I mean, I think you're right about the behavioural scientists. This is some of the recommendations that we make. But the problem is when you have nefarious actors, all these things kind of go out of the window. But you know, without the kind of legal options, then it gets really hard in this case. But
there's no kind of silver bullet to this, obviously.
Excellent. So in the interest of trying to keep to time, if anyone has any questions for Sajal and Ed, I'm sure you'd be happy to answer them after the panel session.
Sure.
Yep, excellent. So thank you once again to you both for your presentations. And that brings the first panel to a close. So I'll hand over to the second panel and can we walk these a bit? Just
I was okay. You want to stop the Benjamin just so that people online can see?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you need to switch. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Excuse me, are we going to be able to put our presentations?
Yes, I think.
I was going to say, yeah.
Presentation.
You have them.
Share the screen. So I'm going to come over here. I just want to get the camera set. Are you guys going to be able to shift down maybe a little bit?
Okay, so there will probably be
Actually, I think I'm fine.
That's the best I can do.
Gonna come here. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
We have official sign. Still could be.
Okay, that sounds great.
I know, I was impressed. No, I'm very.
You'll see.
This, we're gonna away, or if we just put,
It'll be okay. If there's just, we have this panel set up here, so they won't.
Emily should probably come over.
Well, yes.
Numbers, there is numbers, the logistics.
It's gonna be hard to see Benjamin.
No questions, just a few basically saying.
Oh, yeah, what the hell?
Thank you, it's the briefing.
Okay, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, let's have a look, but there are no questions.
Oh, no.
Yes, okay, that was what that's what I thought you meant, but I think we
Okay.
Well, I know you're gonna miss it anyway, but that's great. I just. It's difficult when you're just doing the things. You don't. Okay. Oh, well done. Thank you. It's a good discussion. I didn't get. Thing is with information, missing disinformation, it's nice.
Hey, hello everyone. Breakfast this morning. I could just bring us all to order. Oh, there's somewhere else.
Sit back,
Oh,
because
right. Oh.
we'll shortly run out of time. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I won't say too much, just to say I'm Emily Harmer and I'm going to be moderating this session where we're looking at journalism safety in global context. Everybody's got 10 minutes and I'm going to introduce our first speaker. A few years ago, we found that we'd surveyed a number of women journalists around the world. 20% of them said that they'd been attacked or abused offline in connection with online violence that they'd experienced. So this led to a piece of work which we've just finished the first phase and we're now in the second phase, which is another 2.5 years, funded by the UK Foreign Office, to look into understanding violence against women journalists online and to try to start developing tools to help to detect, predict, and ultimately try and prevent this escalating, especially into offline violence, via a kind of early warning system. So we've done a number of big data case studies where we've collected a large number of tweets relative to certain journalists around the world, women journalists. So we've looked at Maria Ressa, Khada Owais, Rana Ayub, Carol Cadwallader, and a number of others which are gradually being published over the next months. And we collected tweets about them, by them, all replies to them, everything connected with them, and analysed in real time the abuse that they receive in a number of different ways. And we mix this with contextual and background information and produce these case reports. We also worked with Mariana Spring, who's the BBC disinformation reporter, on a recent episode of Panorama, where we studied the escalation of misogynistic hate speech since October 2022, when Elon Musk took over Twitter. We found that abuse against her tripled in that time since Musk took over. And attacks increased as a result of social media protection and safety systems, which they were failing to maintain. So she suffered horrific threats and abuse, cross-platform, including graphic threats of rape. So we need to better understand abuse and its context. And this is what we've been working on. So we built a dashboard which collects and analyzes tweets in real time, relevant to a particular journalist or group of journalists. We identify and characterize abuse directed at them, and then we provide key statistics and graphs, and these all update in real time as the tweets are coming in. And this provides a means for this kind of manual deep dive, as we've done in our case studies, which lets us explore kind of whatever interesting things might emerge from the data. So we don't necessarily know what's going to be there, but through automated analysis and background information, we can do this kind of deep dive where we can then focus manually on the things that the data, the interesting data that emerges from the automated tools. So we can look at things like users, hashtags, tweets, connections between people, abusive terms, types of abuse,
timelines, spikes in volume, spikes in abuse over time, events occurring, topics, keywords, and so on. So basically, we want to know who's being abused, who's abusing them, how are the abusers connected potentially, what's the abuse about, why do people send it, what kind of people are sending this abuse, is it getting worse, how do people respond to it, so the victims of the abuse or just other people, bystanders, what are the effects, and as I said, how we can eventually predict and prevent it escalating. So this is the landing page of the dashboard. I'm just going to show you a few screenshots from the tool. So these are all the journalists that we've been studying. There's a few more as well. And we categorize the abuse in various ways. Again, I won't go into too much detail because I don't have much time, but we essentially categorize, this is all automated. So we categorize it into types such as abuse that attacks a journalist's credibility or reputation, so implying they're not fit for their job, damaging their professional reputation. This could be in terms of veracity. We've talked about misinformation being used to weaponize abuse journalists, and their mental capacity, so kind of insulting their intelligence, saying they're not fit for their job. Belief-based abuse, so this will be attacking their religion, their political views, and so on. And then personal abuse, which is categorized according to misogyny, whether it's sexually explicit, specifically towards or using female or male terms, racist, homophobic, and so on. And there's some examples. So I should have said there's some pretty horrible terms being used here. I'll try not to repeat too many of them. Some examples of, again, sorry, more horrible stuff. So just some screenshots from the dashboard. So we have word clouds, we have spikes in abuse over time, and we've connected them with events that are happening at that time. Breakdown of the categories of abuse. Top abusive terms, this was in Facebook comments towards Maria Ressa, one of our case studies. And these are color coded by type of abuse, so we can see the top terms used. So again, the number of replies to and the number of tweets that got abuse, again over time. So in the case of Rana Ayub, we saw that more than 40% of her tweets had at least one abusive reply, and we can see what happens when she sends, or a journalist sends, a tweet, what happens in response. What kind of abuse does it get? What happens after the tweet the abuse has been sent? And we can start to explore all the data. What triggered the abuse? So which tweets did they send? Which got the most abuse? And then we can go and dig into that and see, again, what happens? What were the abusive replies? Who's sending them? And this is Hadoes, another of our case studies. So in this case, we used tools to analyze the Arabic texts as well as English. So we've worked on a number of languages. How quickly does abuse get sent? So in the case of Rana Ayub, the first abusive reply often comes almost instantly, sometimes within 2 seconds of a tweet being sent. And the majority occurs within 3 minutes this is just within the first hour. So this strongly suggests these are coordinated attacks. We can also look at connections between people sending abuse. So here we can explore networks of all the people that send the abuse towards a specific person. And we can see if they jointly replied to the same tweets, and we can start to see how they're connected together. So my final sort of point then is about these indicators of escalation to offline abuse. And we're publishing these shortly in more detail, but to give you an idea, so some of the indicators of escalation that we want to be able to highlight with the tools, the most serious kinds, so things like death and rape threats, these can be subtle, so sometimes they're in pictures which are really hard to analyze with automated tools. They might extend offline as well. So for example, Patricia Devlin received graffiti death threats in response to her reporting on more than 6 occasions. It might also extend to targeted attacks or threats against family members. Again, Patricia Devlin had personal threats directly to her Facebook Messenger account threatening to rape her newborn baby. Pretty horrific. And nothing was done. Our research showed that 13% of women journalists encounter this type of abuse. And most frequently, it's the most frequently cited impact of this is psychological. There's also intersectional abuse. This picture on the right is Rana Ayub, who was she's been particularly the victim of intersectional abuse because of her religion, her race, and the fact that she's a woman. So she's been trolled by self-identified Hindu nationalists. And then other indicators, doxing can lead to physical stalking and violence. This happened to Maria Ressa. Evidence of orchestrated attacks and disinformation. So we see these large-scale pylons, and this is the kind of thing you can see really clearly with automated tools. Again, and the speed of which replies get sent, the networks of the connections between abuse senders start to lead us to understand this. Also things like trending narratives and hashtags associated with abuse. So we see things like arrest Maria Ressa, Khada Jacuzzi was a whole series of misinformation with trumped up faked pictures of her in a jacuzzi. And finally, long-term or large-scale attacks which have an associated risk of significant psychological harm. We call this networked gaslighting. It builds and builds over time and has a very long-term effect. So finally, some challenges ahead. Trying to understand under the radar abuse, so things like memes, manipulated images, contextual references. These are all really hard for automated tools. Subtle abuse that builds through continuous use and amplification. Again, tools might not pick up on subtle abuse. And again, content moderation systems don't pick up on these things. Tools for correctly identifying the abuse target. I haven't talked about this, but tools which detect abuse don't necessarily detect who the abuse is targeted at. So we have to be very clear who it's targeted at. And in fact, our tools are the only abuse detection tools that actually try and do this. Prediction of escalation is still quite tricky. So how do we know if this is going to escalate or not? How do we know if it's, you know, a random sort of nutter, if it's something that's going to build, or it's just someone having a bad day? Data access, I don't want to get into this issue right now, but especially with Twitter, we've got increasing problems of trying to access the relevant data. We are rolling out the tool to potentially other social media platforms, but Twitter is where a lot of the abuse happens. Languages is a problem. Messages are often in many languages, sometimes within a single message even. Again, problems for automated tools, for content moderation. And so one of the things we're trying to do also is to work with the social media companies to help them develop better solutions rather than, I mean, there are a lot of problems with it, but this is one of our goals, is to try and help them develop better solutions. Okay, hopefully I was just about in time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to move to our second presenter, Mr. Benjamin Teta from Syracuse University, who's looking at Ghana's failing press freedom. Got your thing in not technical issues.
Let's just untangle that because it will give you a bit more. Let's give you a bit more cable.
Oh, what's that?
Yes, we just wait for the slides.
Yeah.
I'll just start as we wait for the slides. Hopefully they will roll on the screen soon. So yes, I'm Benjamin Tete, and I pretty much practiced journalism for almost 20 years from Ghana, but I've done it in the region. Thank you. So yes, I 2018, I decided that I'm tired with newsrooms, and so I came to grad school in NYU, and then now I'm doing my PhD, hopefully finishing soon in Syracuse University. My research today has to particularly do with what we've been discussing, but specifically looking at Ghana's recent drop on the Global Press Index. And I'm using Ghana also because one, Ghana has for quite a long while been like a kind of model in the region of the continent when it comes to press freedom, when it comes to democracy, stability, having consistent transitions in terms of changing government and parties, which is often not the case in some of the regions. Well, it was one of the first, in fact, the first to get independent, but first in context, because there are some countries that traditionally that were free from various, but in the more recent history, 1957, to get independence, following military coups, the country stabilized, and since 92, we've had stable democracy. A lot of the democracy and free transfer of power you could credit to the media. We have what, over 500 plus radio stations. Our capital, Accra, is full of radios and now growing TV. And as I mentioned, up to the past 3-4 years, Ghana was the top 20 when it comes to Global Press Index. In fact, consistently ahead of the US and the UK. 2018, we hosted the World Press Freedom Day, and that's our head of state who made this bold statement saying, I would rather prefer a noisy, boisterous, sometimes querulous media of today to the monotonous praise singing, sycophantic one of yesteryear. Yay. And then barely a year after that, the country witnessed the killing, the gruesome murder of investigative journalist Ahmed Swale. And this guy had operated as an undercover, so his face was not known in public. It's the first killing in recent history in the country. What's more interesting is the killing happened shortly after Swale and this gentleman on the left, the face covered, Anas Anas, who has gained global fame for investigative journalism all over, going to places like the continent, Europe, Asia, to do investigations. And in fact, he was singled out by President Obama for his courageous spirit in uncovering the truth. Well, following an investigation into rot in soccer, football in Africa, they became targets. And this gentleman to my right is a member of parliament, a financier, a self-proclaimed millionaire, and he has his own media, TV and radio station. He sat on TV following that investigation, called these guys crooks, said his supporters should go after them and attack them, and openly said that he would defend them if they did. And then shortly after, he was killed. Today, as we speak, 3 years since Ahmed Swale has been killed, nothing has happened. No single person has been attacked, has been arrested, or even so far, and prosecution is not going. What is rather going on is this gentleman who made these open declarations is today contesting for the presidency of Ghana. And he might as well win in a year or so from now. In 2024, we're going for elections. So someone who made those statements is getting away while journalists like Swale is killed and others are under threat. His case came not just locally, but globally. Here in the US, we saw congressmen calling on the FBI in the US and other international agencies to get involved. Unfortunately, so far, nothing has happened. Meanwhile, to the right is my colleague, Noah. I started journalism with Noah in 2000 with Ghana's first community radio. He is a very fierce journalist. He rose from reporter. Today, he's deputy manager of the station. More recently, he and a team of brave journalists have been leading a campaign to protect the community's right to a salt mine. Governments gave almost a concession of that salt mine that is owned communally to a company. And this business person today is coming after him. Noah, for the past nearly 2 years, has consistently been in court. Unfortunately, right before Easter, a judge decided that they should put him in custody, 2-week custody, unnecessarily, under the guise that he wouldn't appear in court. Meanwhile, he had never missed a single day in court. Other cases are known. This was another colleague with Ghana's biggest private Joy News, Ahmed Latif Idris. Right at our police headquarters, he went covering protests. He was basically his head was more, his car was more broken. Right at the police headquarters, not a single police was identified. And up to today, he is still coming even recently he had to come all the way to the US for treatment. And there are more other people. These are 2 top radio hosts who were recently picked up by national security. Ghana repealed the criminal libel law, but we still have on our code this right after independence era act called the Criminal and Other Offences Act. And in fact, it's such that it says basically this fear and alarm concept became something that is stated in this law. And it says anyone who publishes false information could be guilty of a misdemeanor. Interestingly, what is more threatening for this is that it doesn't matter whether you know that this is true or not. So you could have published genuinely a story. For the fact that a piece of it may be wrong, you are still guilty and you could face up to 5 years in prison. And so I use Ghana's downgrade as yardstick to track journalist perception. I would jump because of, as I mentioned, my own personal experiences with police, with political attack and others. I use them as basis for my story. I'll jump briefly because of the limited time. I've been working with the theoretical frameworks of hierarchy of influence and political economy, specifically looking at impact of state structure and how they impact journalists in the economy. And a lot of our media in Ghana and across the African continent are smaller when you compare to, let's say, Europe and the US. What that also means is there's a lot of economic strain on this, and yet we are seeing journalists boldly doing their work. Segmentation of media as well as commodification, which more of creates this kind of audiences of higher class, higher educated to lower. And I conducted a survey of 55 journalists. Presently, I'm doing in-depth interviews, following with about 25 of them, all of them from a bit of their bio here. And what is coming out clearly as I conclude especially has to do with this fear, this chilling effect, these recent incidents are having on journalists. I've had colleagues who tell me they no longer go after powerful politicians and that they don't go after major stories because of fear. Colleagues who go to public events to cover like press rallies and will not even show their faces. And so what that means is they will not even ask critical questions in public because they feel threatened that supporters may later target them. And so these are posing real threats to what you would have called a bastion of democracy in the region. And so again, it's sort of my hope eventually is looked at Ghana's case, extend it to other regions, make comparative analysis as well to the US. And as I conclude, I'm glad for this year's World Press Freedom Day theme because we need to see how we extend the press freedom concept. In Ghana, we say the media is the fourth estate. What does that mean? We protect our presidency. We protect our MPs. We protect our judiciary. So what's the role of that fourth estate? How do we protect them? Here in the US, First Amendment rights give protection to free press. Supreme Court now ruled to say, not even now, but from Sullivan and NYT and Sullivan, it clearly said it's okay for the media to even air. But sometimes when the media airs, we see this kind of hard clamp down on them. So I think that's protection that needs to be given to that freedom, how we extend it. and hopefully solidify is the case I hope we can make for. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll move to our third presentation, which is with Dr. Lira Ipiragu from the University of the Basque Country, who's going to be discussing safety conditions of journalists covering international conflicts. Thank you. Your presentation saying great insight. Very important if you missed that.
Thank you. I missed that, yes.
Morning. Thank you for the organizing committee for the presentations. I'm excited to be here today in a face-to-face meeting finally, and it also reminds me my dissertation some years ago on my first WordPress Freedom Day. I presented my PhD in 2011. It was about the relation between journalists and military. It was focused on the embedded system that was designed for the Iraq War in 2003. At this moment, I was not in the academia, but then when I came back to the university, I started to prepare my first articles, and they were rejected by different journals. But then one day I received the call for papers for the academic conference of the WordPress Freedom Day that was going to take place in Helsinki. So I sent my proposal, an article based on my PhD. It was accepted. I felt very excited. And I attended to this conference. I didn't know anybody there, but I felt very honored, just like today. I met some interesting people there, such as Jackie Harrison, who was the chair of the session, Ulla Carson and Rita Poitari, who were the organizers, Silvia Chocarro, who unfortunately has not been able to come today, Maria Teresa Garrido, and Roy Crowell from the Metropolitan University of Oslo. Actually, in Helsinki, I discovered that a conference focused on safety of journalists was going to take place in Oslo, and I went to Oslo. And these two experiences, Helsinki and Oslo, the people I met there, the initiatives like the Journalist Safety Research Network that was launched at this moment, all these points have been the key for me, the key in the way I have developed my research during the last years. Also, my research stay in the Munich, University of Munich with Thomas Hanitz and his team. And all that has made it possible for me to be here today. So the reason why I'm giving you all this explanation is that traditionally, the focus of our research in our research group in Vitarbes at the University of the Basque Country, were the working conditions of journalists, not only the labor conditions, but also the professional conditions. And we decided to change the focus. We assume that safety of journalists is the base from where we can get into all the elements that condition the journalist's work with an holistic view. So 3 years ago, in the pandemic, we started to design a research project to study the safety of journalists covering international conflicts. We applied for funds to the Ministry of Science and Innovations of the Spanish government. It was rejected with a good punctuation, but rejected. So we applied again in the call for 2021, and we got it. It is a 4-year project starting in September 2022. So we are in the beginning. And as I already said, it is based in our previous research. During the last years, we have been mainly doing in-depth interviews to journalists, both freelance and staff journalists, media editors, and military. This last profile, military, may need an explanation, and is that in Spain, journalist training in safety issues is assumed by the army. Since 2003, they offer safety training for 25 journalists each year. So we consider that their experience and their perceptions could be of interest for our research. And I would like to underline 3 points among the results of this previous research. Those are journalists. First one is that the Spanish journalists do not have the necessary safety conditions to do their work. All the interviews affirm that in the last decades, the working conditions of conflict journalists have worsened. So despite the agreement in the research field and the recommendations of all international organizations, only half of the journalists interviewed have been trained in safety issues. The majority have received the course provided by the Spanish Army, and almost all the journalists have done it on their initiative, not at media's proposals. In addition to this, the lack of safety equipment is tricky. Most staff journalists have equipment provided by the media, but not all of them. And in the case of freelance journalists, some have paid for it, others have rented it or shared it with colleagues. In the worst cases, they do not have any equipment. Regarding insurance, in the case of staff journalists, they are funded by the media, but the majority of freelancers interviewed admitted that they have worked just sometimes with insurance. And the precariousness of the profession in Spain is particularly ruthless in conflict journalism. Both freelance and staff journalists confess that salaries have fallen and that working conditions have worsened. An illustrative example is that in the case of freelancers, the range of prices paid by the Spanish media per news piece is between 35 and 175 euros. Obviously, this impacts directly in their safety and working conditions. In relation to trauma management, Spanish journalists do not recognize having suffered any impact, neither post-traumatic stress disorder. But when they answer specific questions, most admit that some coverage have left an emotional scar, nightmares, difficulty adapting to normal life, sensitivity to noise, and lack of understanding or empathy. Initially, only 2 of journalists admitted having suffered trauma impact, and they have received treatment. But in both cases, it was paid and managed by themselves. All journalists confirm that in the newsroom, editors do not show any interest. It is still a taboo. And what editors said, well, none of the media have a risk assessment form when sending someone to a conflict zone or when hiring someone on the ground. Regarding safety equipment and special insurance, statements are contradictory. Some media claim to provide equipment and insurance to journalists, but journalists who work for those media maintain the opposite version, especially freelancers. And in relation to gender, we have this challenge of how to balance the recognition of double victims for women journalists and their empowerment and professional rights. So based in these results, we propose the JOSAFCON project. Our hypothesis is that Spanish journalists do not have the necessary working conditions to do their work in a safe way. The general aim is to identify what are the safety conditions that a journalist must have to cover a conflict to guarantee this press freedom and the right for information and provide evidences. These are some of the specific objectives. And to this aim, we have also a team. I would say that is an excellent team, and I really appreciate their implication in this project. The research team is composed by Spanish researchers, most of them from the University of the Basque Country. But also we have a working team with PhD students, researchers that are working in international organizations, military in charge of safety training for journalists, professionals with a long career covering international conflicts, and researchers of other European countries. The youngest member is 20 years old, and we also have a retired colleague who is still doing research. We have professors, and we have also students. As I said, it is a work in progress. We started 6 months ago, but now we have our starting point, that is a theoretical or conceptual framework with a diachronical design, taking into account defining elements of safety before, during, and after the coverage, we are adapting this schema with different levels. And of course, the model presented by Professor Vera Slacheva is also an inspiring reference. We are completing a census of journalists who have been covering some milestones of international conflicts in the last 30 years. We have identified 435 professionals, and we are going to start now with the snowball technique with the help of journalists who are members of the team. And we have already started with one of the most important part of the project is the transfers or impact. We are working in the theoretical, but also in the environment. We have PhD students doing their dissertation connected to this issue, colleagues who are starting the research in this subject. We have students doing her undergraduate project with us, and we are also trying to approach bachelor students. We are 2 weeks ago, we organized some talks to students with members that came to Bilbao, and we are also planning to visit during the summer some newsrooms. So looking forward, we need to finish this census. We need to go on with the theoretical framework and start designing the questionnaire we would like to send to journalists. These are plans for the next 6 months, and of course, all the contributions will be more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The delays, we haven't got that much time for questions, so I'm thinking if people could keep them quite brief, we could take sort of 2 or 3 questions if people have them. Anyone in the chat as well? Oh, sorry, yes.
I have a question for Diana. About helping them to sort of tackle the online abuse and how to prevent that. What your impressions were about their sincerity, their genuine interest. Whether you could, provide us with some insights on that.
Yeah, the short answer is it's very difficult, and it's kind of limited. But I mean, we're in the process of doing this at the moment. What we're establishing various advisory boards and so on. So, as I say, we're trying to work with them, but it is very difficult, and with Twitter at the moment, it's which is our main source of information at the moment, it's particularly difficult. I mean, we still don't know what's exactly happening with the data access. The first issue is data access. So I think the primary thing that we need in order to do this kind of research is to get proper access to the data. And this is really problematic, and it's becoming more and more problematic. So that's the first step, is having these conversations and trying to get proper access to the data so that we can work with them. We have been also working with, in the first stage we were working with the harassment manager tools developed by Jigsaw. But they're currently, I'm not sure what's happening with the status of those at the moment, but we did actually implement tools to integrate them into our work so that we can combine our analysis with what they already have and provide. As I say, and they were really receptive to working together with them. But yeah, it's all very much a state of flux at the moment. So the answer is, I mean, we're not super hopeful, but even if it's small steps, but it is difficult because there are a lot of issues with the way in which content moderation is done and the access. So I think small steps, but we're doing what we can.
Can I have another question on data? Because I'm wondering if you're measuring, evaluating the bots and trolls and how they affect data, because this is something that is huge. So I don't know how you're.
Yeah, so we have in the past done work. So we also have a huge strand of work looking at misinformation, and we have studied or tried to study the issue exactly of detecting bots in the context of sending misinformation as much as anything. So one of the things that we're trying to do in the tool is looking, as I kind of vaguely referred to, looking at indicators that there might be this kind of coordinated behavior going on, whether it's actual bots, whether it's trolls. I mean, it's a kind of fuzzy line, but things. So we're looking at ways in which we can try and identify this kind of suspicious networked coordinated behavior. And we have been able to identify clusters of users which, you know, have very, very similar properties, which, yeah, as I say, the time it takes, I mean, 2 seconds from sending a tweet, you know, routinely, not just, you know, in a one-off. You see this time and again in the case of Rana, that's clearly, you know, there's suspicious activity. We can never say for sure, so we have to be careful what we say. So what we're doing is but essentially we can say that, you know, this is highly likely to be coordinated attacks and so on. We can never be, you know, 100% sure. So we have to be a little bit careful about what we, you know, about what we say. But yeah, this is exactly one of the tools. So there's a number of, you know, mechanisms that we're looking into for trying to establish this kind of behavior. But yeah, it's a very important aspect, definitely.
I think I'm afraid, only have time for one more question. Oh, there's someone behind. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to all of you for some excellent presentations. It was great listening to all that. And certainly you all here have raised some very pertinent topics to be further on explored. Well, personally, I am a university lecturer in Brussels and Romania, and I also used to work in these EU institutions in Brussels. So when at some point at the Commission, maybe mainly, but also at the Parliament for a while, when specifically some very interesting topic was raised, the very evidence policy, evidence-based actually research, evidence-based policy making. We quite have lots of discussions in Brussels as well, more and more, even when it's about lobbying. Let's say we really look a lot into evidence-based, lobbying. So arguments, what kind of arguments lobbies, for instance, they bring, are they legitimate, are they valid, but also are they quite accurate? That's quite a big question. Sometimes I have students in class coming and ask me, Professor, how can I distinguish between false and correct information? Because my intention, many of them, they say, is really to operate with correct information from the beginning to the end, as they realize very clearly that if they don't do so, even the results of their research would be, of course, pretty much problematic. So I would, kindly ask this question to anyone who might be willing to respond. What would you say to students asking, how can we distinguish between false information and accurate information? That's on the one hand. And I have a second question for you, if I may. As we are living in this digital era, and of course, lots to say about it, we also have this quite remarkable report, digital news report, prepared by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in the UK and Oxford University in the UK. And certainly, they are not just touching upon what the current situation in that sense is right now as we speak, but also what might come next. So what are the tendencies, the trends? And the conclusion they absolutely put it there loud and clear is that digitalization, we like it or not, is there to stay. And now we also speak about this ChatGPT. It's pretty recent, but still we have a big discussion in universities around that in terms of plagiarism and not only critical thinking, creativity, originality, personal contribution, and how all that can be impacted. And my question also for you would be what you might consider to be, let's say, the impact of this digitalization, the impact of this ChatGPT, specifically on the academic field, but also on the very media environments, just the same. Back ago, I used to be a journalist as well years ago, and I even studied journalism and communication at some point. And we had, of course, this principle we were focusing quite a lot, always check the validity of the information you're going to send to the public out there, at least from 2 different sources. I'm not sure if this is still always, let's say, sufficiently considered, looking into this misinformation, fake news, disinformation. So those would be the questions. Sorry, maybe I was a bit too, let's say long, but those would be the questions for you. And I'm, of course, very grateful if someone could just offer your perspective on that. Again, distinguishing between false and accurate information, what might be your stand on it? And second, the very impact of digitalization, ChatGPT on the academic world, but also on the very media environment. Thank you very much.
We could keep any answers brief, just because we are 5 minutes over and we need to
I'll
be out
bite
of
on the
here by 1,
misinformation thing, just
Yeah.
to point you at, we've had a number of European projects, developing tools for journalists to help them identify misinformation. So there was a big European project that finished, I think, last year called We Verify. And there are various other ones we're working on now. One is Vera.ai. So I'd encourage you to have a look at those. So we've basically been building kind of dashboards and whole toolkits to provide methods for people to verify things like images and their sources, indicators of misinformation and verification. So that would be my answer to that. For ChatGPT and AI, I could take half a day to talk about that. But
Exactly.
yeah, I mean, the short answer to that question is they're amazing tools, but you have to be very, very careful in how you interpret them and what you do with them.
Use them responsibly. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we'd better move on to the final panel, just because we do have another event coming in after here. So I'm can we thank our speakers, and hopefully there'll be discussion afterwards.
Let's get the second panel or the third panel set up. One moment. Okay, Dr. Shapiro, you are on.
I'll do a quick introduction, but I'm very aware that we're pressed for time. So hi, my name is Ros Southern from the University of Liverpool, and I'm delighted to be introducing the final panel of this event. I think everyone knows the ground rules, 10 minutes. I will wave this rather alarming piece of paper at you when you have 2 minutes, and it's even more alarming one when it's time to wrap up. But yes, our first speaker is Ivor Shapiro, and he is going to be speaking about the journalism school as a space for the discussion of freedom of expression. So I'd like to invite him.
Thank you so much. And this is what this title of my abstract is what I think the many British colleagues around might call a shite headline. So let's get rid of that. And maybe just put it this way: there are some trickier than they look questions about press freedom that should get significantly more academic attention, in my opinion, than they do get. This is a confession. I'm 69 years old. I've been in reading and thinking about these issues for a long time, and only recently, in researching my new book, Shameless Self-Promotion, I passed around a brochure about it. It's called The Disputed Freedoms of the Disputed Freedoms of a Disrupted Press, and it has confronted me with things I used to take for granted that I now realize deserve a lot more critical attention than at least I have given them, but also I sense that I am not alone. So these are some examples of these tricky questions. And these are some others. And why are they important? It seems to me, and we had a bit of a teaser for this, I think, in a couple of our discussions earlier today, that the arguments made for journalist safety, for news media autonomy, for efforts to combat disinformation, these arguments that rest on the idea that media freedom, that news media autonomy is in fact a social good, are not accepted widely. And that I think one reason why they're not accepted widely is that they're not particularly persuasive. One reason. So, take that one, for example, this question, we've all sat in rooms where someone says, but who is a journalist? And immediately, the eyes glaze over, you've been there, you know it. Who cares right now? Who cares anymore who is a journalist is the response. For me, it's just one example of, and a pretty obvious example of the ubiquitous and unchallenged ambiguities in these questions in academics and journalist discourse about press freedom, about freedom of expression, about human rights in general, and about journalists' professional roles in particular, that just are not interrogated in a way that is persuasive to anyone really who kind of looks at them carefully, and particularly in the general public. I realize that's a provocative statement to make, but I make it nevertheless. To me, to be clear, in my opinion, about that first question, Tucker Carlson is not a journalist, but drawing this conclusion is not as simple as it would seem from people who would say that. It doesn't depend, for example, on where he worked last week or where he'll work next week, or what his opinions are on important social matters, or it doesn't even have much to do with his, let us say, idiosyncratic approach to ethics. It doesn't have anything to do with any of that, but most people wouldn't know that from listening to the arguments. Press freedom, another, trickier than it looks question. Press freedom is a form of freedom of expression. I would say that to UNESCO, our UNESCO colleagues, this is a real failure in UNESCO's discourse on these matters, where it is frequently treated as a subset of freedom of expression. And it denies the fact that there are things that journalists ask for or claim under the law and under custom that are not part of freedom of expression at all. That journalists frequently claim and are given in many constitutional democracies rights that are not available to ordinary human beings who are not journalists. And that suggests that the rights claimed, protection of confidential source, access to certain spaces, particular efforts to protect journalists as opposed to protect anyone. These things are claimed as if they're a particular freedom. And they are, of course, claimed under the heading of press freedom or news media autonomy. But in fact, they have nothing to do with publication. They have nothing to do with the expression of anything. They are more to do with the gathering of news, which is not about expression. So they have nothing to do with the roots of free expression discourse and freedom of the press discourse and the claims made by the printers of former centuries, by the publishers, the news media barons of former centuries. These claims are not relevant to the claims made by news media, I would suggest. The demands of press freedom must be weighed against the fulfillment of other human rights, true or false. I would argue that, like all these other questions, the best answer is more like maybe in some situations, right? Why? Because press freedom here is being confused with freedom of expression, which is a fundamental human right. Not just the people in this room, but everyone in this city and everyone on this planet was born with freedom of expression, according to all of our traditions of human rights law. The same is not true of press freedom. Press freedom is a reserved right at best, claimed by certain people, but not by others, on behalf of society and consistently with a particular role in society. Yeah, let's leave it there. I mean, what I'm trying to say is they're intersecting Venn sets. And there are some things that under the heading of press freedom that are not in the set of freedom of expression at all. So, for example, commentary, the availability of public access to important perspectives is a very important value of free expression, but it is not fundamental to the particular task of the press, with all due respect to a whole thread of scholarship on these matters that afflicted us during the 20th century. I could say more, obviously, but I want to move on to this one. I'm going to skip that one. This is a quote from Jane Kirtley. Jane Kirtley is one of this country. We're here, of course, we're here in a country which has a particular claim to be the owner of press freedom, the inventor of press freedom, indeed the inventor of free expression. All of these claims, of course, are wrong, but there is certainly a sense that the First Amendment is the be-all and end-all of these matters. Jane Kirtley, a very famous media lawyer, says these things, culminating in, and this was regarding the Fox Dominion case, culminating in its a sense of discomfort with the courts determining what constitutes ethical news gathering. People from every other country under English common law, under European law, and various other systems of law would argue that courts are very good places to interrogate the ethics of journalism. Why? Because journalists are claiming particular freedoms that are predicated upon their fulfillment of a social function. To the extent that they are fulfilling that social function, they are entitled to make this claim. But like other reserved rights, they are not entitled to make this claim if they are not fulfilling that prime social function. This question I will leave to you and your readership of my book and your familiarity with Norwegian law, for example, but I will end with this one and suggest that the arguments around credibility about the news are a major distraction from the real points about responsibility. And if we look at the research done by the Reuters Institute on public trust in the media, we will find that people's trust is highly related to their social obligations, to their fulfillment of the social obligations of journalism. Thank you very much.
Well, that was bang on time. I didn't even need to use the.
Oh God, I was so scared.
Just before I introduce our second speaker, I'd really like to encourage people at home to drop their questions in the chat. We'd really love to hear from you if you have any burning questions. But our second speaker today is Smitha Khorana, who will be talking about the need for interdisciplinary work on freedom of expression.
Thank you to the organizers and for the invitation to speak today. I'm happy that I'm following Professor Shapiro's talk because they actually relate quite a bit. And some of these conceptual questions that Dr. Shapiro has been bringing up are the very questions that I've been trying to deal with in my own work in both academia and in the nonprofit world. So the presentation I'm presenting is based on a paper I'm currently crafting, the bulk of which is about how we can see freedom of expression in the digital age specifically. It's broadly about the way that two dominant forces of the past 20 years of history, neoliberalism and the global war on terror, have shaped our speech environment profoundly and have shaped the way the internet and platforms have developed and approached policies around freedom of expression. And yet the way that we've been framing freedom of expression doesn't really collapse these two distinct historical threads. It's an argument for comprehensive interdisciplinary work the idea that we need to embrace a fundamental reorganizing of the academic disciplines, that the problem of freedom of expression is so deeply under threat today, and it's indicative of the severity of our larger sort of crisis of human rights. And that in order to approach it, we really need to rethink both the structures and the methodologies of academic work. It's based on my experiences working at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism between 2014 and 2016, and the nonprofit Data and Society during the pandemic. Many of the critiques in the slideshow have already been covered, which is actually good for time. And so my presentation will focus a little bit more now on the practicalities of doing interdisciplinary work in this particular field, and the importance of maintaining the integrity of academic research in this field as we struggle to access both the data and the policy work from tech companies. And I bring that up because data has gotten a lot of attention, but in some of my work, which spanned both strict academic research, but also having a connection to sort of the informal and ad hoc conversations that have been going on between technologists, people in the nonprofit field, and the tech companies, specifically on things like content moderation in these moments of crises during the pandemic and during the Trump years. Academics and researchers who are firmly rooted in the university have had a lot more trouble getting access to both those conversations and discourses and sort of the policy frames that are being applied. Even just to know what's going on has been a struggle. And so besides the data, I think we really have to advocate and find new methodologies to begin to approach this work. And part of that is also going back to some of the analog techniques and giving them more credibility, because computational work has sort of gained precedence, and we need to reground ourselves in some of the basic disciplines and ideas around things like philosophy and ethics and the law, because the problems that we're dealing with are so new. So with that, I'll start the slideshow. So freedom of expression is often characterized as an amorphous right. After the end of the Cold War, efforts by academics and civil society focused a lot on the protection of journalists' physical safety, which continues to be a problem and is essential. But there was an assumption that political rights were tied to economic liberalization and market economies post-1990, that the best way to embrace human rights was by embracing the unregulated market. And over the years, we've really seen that assumption break down. After the beginning of the war on terror in 2001, and I'm going to add that my perspective on this issue is deeply imbued by my own experience of coming of age during this moment, the end of the roaring 90s and the moment of a pivotal global shift in ideologies. In this moment, there's an additional focus on the free flow of information. The work of civil society groups and the human rights community seem to shift to issues around government transparency, mass surveillance, protecting whistleblowers. These are all essential issues. They're issues that I've worked on myself. And this kind of also is consistent with some of Dr. Shapiro's points that these are very important, but they're starkly different than the idea of freedom of expression for everybody. And I think we have to separate those two and then kind of bring them back together and understand what's going on in our digital ecosystem. So these issues often lacked broad appeal to the public. They became very obscure, and they were really about the governments, a lot of Western governments sort of protecting the public from information at the war on terror and making choices on the free flow of information. So freedom of expression globally was not tied to basic human rights rhetoric during this moment. It felt like it's, from our perspective, it was really tied to a niche community of activists, scholars, technologists, and the relationship between the thorny issues that were coming up around internet regulation and counterterrorism and analog issues around freedom of expression were not well established. So in this paper, I asked what has changed, and the framing may seem simplistic, but for this presentation, I'm trying to make it accessible to a broader non-academic audience as well, because I know UNESCO's work and community spans both civil society and academia. In the past 20 years, as I mentioned, we've seen this assumption break down. And part of that also has to do with the promotion of unregulated movement of goods and technology across borders, but not people or ideas. Neoliberalism and our economic regime has privileged a sort of concept of globalization that hasn't necessarily taken into account protecting the free flow of information. It may be there, but it's secondary. And I bring this up a lot in terms of my own work that's developing on platform regulation and the way that platform regulation has been framed. So many of these issues came at us so fast post 2016 that frames sort of rose to the surface, but they didn't really build on what we already had. And they didn't necessarily have the rigor that we need as we go forward and realize that platforms are not going anywhere. And so these issues in terms of regulation and government's freedom of expression will have to be interrogated in a deeper way. As a result of a lot of this, the left-right binary has been unraveled to a certain extent in terms of political ideology. And In my perspective, global digitization has been essential to this process, but we don't really understand it. And the misinformation frame is woefully inadequate in explaining it, and it's causing a lot of problems. I know other talks have also spoken to this reality. Some have been calling it a digital polycrisis. In my own work, I'm attempting to map out and explain how this crisis implicates and has implicated information ecologies for the past 30 or so years, tracing the intellectual currents and dissonances that have contributed to our own collective failure to fight for our own rights. And so I bring up now the idea that the right to freedom of expression is a foundational right. It's the right upon which all other rights are contingent. But we don't see that, and we've talked about this also today, we don't see that being adopted or socialized broadly. And I think that especially in the discourse about platforms, we have to start thinking about the way that the right to freedom of expression is secured. Citizens can organize themselves to fight for all these other human rights that have come into, that have been threatened in the past 20 years through these economic shifts. So the right to water, food, clean air, education, sanitation. And this is really important when you talk about the rise of liberalism or the rise of autocracy and what has really been going on the ground with platforms in these countries. And this is the information that I think as journalists and academics, we need to both seek out the reporting because it's not available, and people who are trying to get that information are under very severe threat, and then to theorize from legal theorists and create policy instead of allowing the tech companies and governments to create this policy. We need to kind of insert ourselves in a far more aggressive way and in a far more rigorous way. And citizen journalism is really important when we talk about this question of, do people really care about journalism? Maybe not, but maybe they don't understand, or we haven't made explicit the link between this new technology, the smartphone and the platforms, and what it means to be a citizen journalism, and how the role of self-publishing has just changed all of our conception of this ecosystem very, very fast, faster than we can really keep up with. In the past 20 years, we also see something else happening, and this relates to what I just spoke about. Authoritarian leaders around the globe are democratically elected, and though they constrain the rights of the press and the right to speak and think freely for their own citizens, they're often reelected, or they lose reelection on very narrow margins. So again, for me, this has to do with the fact that we haven't really approached what has happened during the war on terror and what has happened with neoliberalism, and how the material reality of freedom of expression has changed, and how the concepts of check regulation have been deeply impacted by the ideology of neoliberalism. I would now like to spend a few minutes speaking about what happens when we don't use the tools of academia to promote rigorous research. In the paper, there's a case study of the period between 2016 to 2020. I don't think I'll have time to go over that today, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I don't like to present problems without also beginning to think about solutions. So this is a list of sort of urgent research areas that I think require both academics to work, but also what I was talking about, a sort of fundamental reorganizing of the way that we're approaching interdisciplinary work. And for me, that having worked at different tiers of the academic at university, I think that it is both a question of methodology and discipline, but it's also a question of organization and management, and allowing both students and professors to work collaboratively, changing the incentive structures of paper writing and tenure. That's the only way that we're going to get the information that we need, allowing people to work between journalism and academia, finding ways to help fund journalists or help academics learn the tools of reporting, which are really essential to understanding what's going on the ground. I'm going to again skip ahead and save some for the paper because I think I'm running out of time. I think we have to work slowly and collaboratively in response to the move fast and break things. And I say that specifically because having been in the nonprofit sector as well, there was a sort of impulse to match the speed of tech companies as they're making decisions on content moderation ad hoc during the pandemic. And for me, that was a real crisis point, that we needed to think slowly about the consequences of concepts like fake news, concepts like information disorder, that every concept that we end up releasing to the ecosystem that maybe hasn't gone through peer review, hasn't gone through the critiques of the larger community, can really risk having all kinds of knock-on effects down the road. And we see that in legislation all over the world that was brought up that is on fake news, that has been really worrisome for citizens and has real material consequences. I think I'm at the end. This is the last slide. It's what are the risks when we begin to reshape the management of incentive structures of academia. I think that's also important to talk about. You can read it, but I think that when we embark on this sort of experimental work, we have to make sure that everybody's taken care of, that everybody has a voice, and that we don't just privilege the knowledge of technologists, the knowledge of tech, that we continue to sort of give priority as well to hundreds of years of work on philosophy, ethics, and the law, and make sure that we're really, being careful about what we're building and trying to find a way to make academia more relevant at this critical moment. Thank you.
Got that up very skillfully, I must say. Okay, so our final speakers are Colette Falkvist and Vinod Bhattarai, who are going to be speaking about National Human Rights Institute.
National Human Rights Institutions as anchors for journalist safety. I think as the slides are coming up, I will just dive right into a slow introduction. And we'll keep it lively and finish strong this afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Okay, super. We're bringing it down really to the ground now. We were very theoretical for our past two. Thank you. To start, I'm going to give a very quick past, present, future to what brought us to our paper that we've drafted. I personally have to wave my CSO flag. I work for International Media Support, which is notably not an academic institution, but we do have a small research program that I lead. IMS is working in around the world in countries of armed conflict, political transition, and human insecurity. A large part of that is, of course, providing for an enabling environment for journalists to work in. Dr. Jalassi did give us a brief introduction to the UN Plan of Action. That is a big part of our work. This is this roadmap that my good colleagues around the country, around the world are looking to develop their programs, and specifically all of the work that we do on journalist safety. This is how we across sectors are working together holistically and proactively to support journalist safety. This UN Plan of Action was endorsed in 2012. So count 10 years down the road. That finally brings us to our first slide. 2022 was a very busy year, I think, for many of us in this room. Is this UNESCO row, I know, marking 10 years of the UN Plan of Action. There were several consultations, regional and thematic, certainly many from the academic side. One of the key recommendations from UNESCO was establishing multi-stakeholder protection and/or accountability mechanisms, dedicated units for monitoring, investigation, and prosecution, and provide adequate resources to this end. The big question that we get a lot is, what is the mechanism? Thank you. Okay, to the next slide. IMS put together this definition leading up to marking 10 years of the UN plan, that we have been dancing around this work and doing so much to support journalist safety in so many different ways. That I will also read this off and kind of highlight some of the bolded words here. But this is organized collaboration between multiple stakeholders within a national context, working to improve the safety of journalists through prevention, protection measures, prosecution of perpetrators, with a common understanding of the issue being dynamic, open-ended. When we say organized collaboration, we're thinking about a meeting of stakeholders that is institutionalized. Like, are you meeting regularly? This is something that, is this happening not ad hoc, but it's actually a regular organized meeting. I highlight national context here because we just want to underscore that every national context is different, and therefore and unique due to its socio-political status. So there's no blueprint for the work that we're doing, and so we always want to underscore that when we're building a national safety mechanism. Next, you have the 3 Ps. This is prevention, protection, and prosecution. This is the holistic approach that we've turned to, that's kind of been developed, over the course of the outset from the UN Plan of Action. So this is, what are we doing beforehand, during, and in the face of an attack? Are the perpetrators being held to account? Lastly, having this engagement being dynamic and open-ended. Dynamic looks to the fact that 10 years ago, digital threats were not so much included in this UN Plan of Action. So we have to be ready to adapt to new and evolving and emerging threats that are out there. And the fact that it's open-ended, we don't want to, there's, unless we are really in this ideal world where every single human right is being upheld, we have to keep this going and open. And I note in the margins here that there are many different initiatives and trainings, monitoring, legal aid, mental health, psychosocial well-being to consider to support safety of journalists within this so-called mechanism. And it's got to include everyone, certainly from an intersectional approach. So that leaves me to Bernard to tell you a little bit about how we got to the objective of our paper, and specifically why national human rights institutions are key to developing these mechanisms.
Hello, everybody. I'll get directly into it. So the whole idea was we wanted to look at journalist safety from a solution point of view, rather than just problematize the problem and just beat that donkey again and again and again. Then we stumbled into human rights institutions, which was something we had just started experimenting in early 2012 with our own human rights commission. So that's where we started looking into their laws, their mandates, how they function, why they function. And we just thought maybe they were the right institutions to be trying to help with safety of journalists. So they are actually state institutions, mostly constitutional or legal under separate law, independent from government, and publicly funded, even though it's not enough. We said okay, here's everything that we need. And then many have investigative authority, many even have litigation authority. So we said why are we trying to find another organization to help with safety of journalists? Let's look at them deeper. And we also found them to be the bridge between civil society and government. So that's the reason we said, okay, let's try to make a case for this. And let's skip this part right now because we are running over time. So we'll come back to this. Maybe we'll tell you about this picture later. No. So, okay. So now, as I said, their state bodies and public funding and investigative authority. And they even have that power to, in a way, report directly to the heads of governments or parliaments, and also to the Human Rights Council. And then, we have everything right here within them, even though not all of them might be functioning in the way they should be. So we just thought, let's look at them. And they are, again, finally, they still hold very much of convening power. They can get national authorities together on any issue to discuss them, which is why we said, maybe these are the agencies we should be looking at, and they're going to be around forever. So you take it on from here. We won't have time. So how much do you want to talk about?
No, well, I wasn't going to be able to do justice to everything that is on this slide. Bernard skipped over our methodology and kind of what brought us here. IMS has been working with the development of national safety mechanisms for, definitely 10, arguably 20 plus years since its inception. And so in our paper and essentially in a literature review that we've done from a series of all of our publications and reporting and the actually a small bit of research on national protection mechanisms. I look forward to the one-stop shop that we are putting together because we couldn't find too much. And so this paper kind of brings a lot of this together, revisits the landmark publication from 2017 that IMS produced. It really breaks down national context in Afghanistan, Colombia, Indonesia, etc. And something that's also key in our work here is diving in and looking at the different structures and this is of these national safety mechanisms. And the big piece here is thinking about where the threats are coming from predominantly. And that's where you want to keep away from a little bit when you're anchoring these mechanisms. For instance, in Colombia, the first mechanism was threats were coming from paramilitary, so the mechanism was grounded with the government to start. So.
Okay, again, we're very sorry about this. It's ended, so we'll leave it to this and we can talk about it over lunch. I'll just get to the final research areas that we thought would be important was we need to look at the institutions themselves, the NHRIs, because I think they already have some of the basic things that we are trying to look for and try to look at their procedures, regulations, their institutional cultures, and see how we could actually help make them more effective. And that I think we should be focusing on in terms of from the academy so that we can try to convince 2 UN agencies, OHCHR and UNESCO, to start also looking somewhere else nationally. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've got 2 minutes, but I think because people here will have chance to ask their questions over lunch, I think someone had their hand up, if I saw that correctly. So Augusto, were you trying to ask a question?
No, they can't ask questions like that. They can only ask them in the chat. There are no questions in the chat because it's set up as a webinar. So the only question we have is, can we get the papers? I mean, we're happy to share the PowerPoints, and if anyone has full papers, or maybe just email them to Christos. You have all heard from him when your paper was initially accepted. So yes, please send. Oh, we have the PowerPoint actually. Sorry. Yeah,
PowerPoints are already there.
Yeah, if you have full papers, do send us to us. If you're happy for us to share the PowerPoint, we can do that. So unless you object to it, we will assume you're happy for us to share them, if that's okay. Yeah, sorry. Maybe a couple of questions if we have any from the floor, and then we can bring it to a close.
Yes, otherwise, yes. Thank you. Again, excellent presentations, and I put here, I'm taking notes as you speak, and I put here them some very interesting points again. Touching upon the very freedom of expression, would you consider there are some limits to it? Perhaps. Why I'm asking that? Because, in Brussels over the years, in these EU institutions, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, we were having plenty of discussions in terms of should we regulate, this territory, let's say, social media in general, better, stronger? Should there be tougher regulation? And here views are really split. Some they say, yes, of course, you have to do that, because otherwise, you see, it might not be very balanced in terms of content and so on and so forth being put on those platforms. It might even become, let's say, a danger for the society. Others, they are saying, no, you should not regulate more than that, because it can be that the very freedom of expression would be then affected. What would be your stand on it?
I think obviously it's a very important and complex question, but the established, I think, consensus among both lawyers, civil rights lawyers, and philosophers is that freedom of expression is indeed limited by, and generally speaking, is indeed limited by the risk of harm to either individuals in terms of physical harm, or to harm to other civil rights, other fundamental human rights. And of course, that's a very big question. That is what we are all engaged with, I'm sure, in some way, all the time.
Oh, sorry. If I may just.
We're gonna have to close very soon. I'm sorry. We've
Have
run
a
out
very
of time.
brief comment.
Sure, I do think it's an area where we need a lot more research, especially in terms of genocide prevention. I think that we need to understand the relationship between speech and behavior much more through a variety of disciplines. And the conventional wisdom became in 2016 that the platforms are private companies and can't be regulated, but I think that that was in their benefit. And we really need to question that stance a bit. I think there are probably instances where there should be some kind of oversight, but again, that's for that threat of the war on terror and meetings that were going on for the 15 years before at the UN and on content moderation to frame differently have influenced the debate profoundly.
Okay, we can continue these discussions over lunch, but I think it's time to draw this to a close. So let's give a final round of applause to all our.